I needed to get away. The pressure of work had been overwhelming for months. The ceaseless grind of the city traffic, noise, crowds, it felt like it was suffocating me. Each day at the office was more exhausting than the last, and I felt like I was sinking into a routine that was crushing my spirit. So when I saw an ad for a remote cabin rental deep in the woods, it seemed like the perfect solution. The listing promised solitude and peace. It was miles away from any town or neighbors, surrounded by dense forest, and it didn't even have Wi-Fi. The isolation appealed to me in a way that was almost primal. No screens, no phones, just me and nature. A weekend to clear my head, breathe some fresh air, and find a bit of calm. The drive was longer than I had anticipated, and as I left the city behind, the landscape around me grew wilder. The paved roads gave way to gravel paths that snaked through thick woods. By the time I reached the last turnoff, I hadn't seen another car for over an hour. The setting sun cast long shadows through the trees, and the forest grew denser with each passing mile. When I finally arrived at the cabin, it was already dusk. The cabin itself was small and rustic, built of weathered logs, nestled in a small clearing surrounded by towering pine trees. The sight of it felt like stepping into another time, a world far removed from the modern chaos I'd left behind. I parked the car and got out, breathing in the cool, crisp air. It was so quiet, no city hum, no people. Just me and the wind rustling through the leaves. Inside, the cabin was simple but cozy, a stone fireplace, an old wooden table, a couple of chairs, and a single bed in the corner. The windows looked out into the forest, and the fading light cast long shadows across the floor. I dropped my bag, built a fire, and poured myself a drink, feeling the tension slowly drain from my body as I sank into the chair by the hearth. This was exactly what I needed. And that first evening passed uneventfully. I sat by the fire, sipping whiskey and listening to the crackle of the flames, letting the warmth soak into my bones. The solitude felt good, almost therapeutic. I read a bit from the book one brought along, and eventually, as the fire died down, I crawled into bed, falling into the deepest sleep I'd had in months. The next morning, I woke to the sound of birds chirping outside, the sunlight streaming through the window. I felt more rested than I had in weeks. After breakfast, I decided to spend the day exploring the woods around the cabin. With no schedule to keep, I packed a small lunch, filled a water bottle, and set out into the forest. The air was fresh and invigorating as I made my way along a faint trail that snaked between the trees. The forest here felt ancient, untouched by human hands, with towering pines and dense undergrowth that seemed to swallow up the daylight. As I walked, the quiet of the forest became more noticeable. There was no hum of insects, no calls of birds, just the occasional creak of branches swaying in the breeze and the muffled crunch of leaves beneath my boots. I hiked for hours, enjoying the stillness, but as the afternoon wore on, I began to notice something strange. Some of the trees had deep, jagged gouges in their trunks, marks that looked like they had been made by something sharp and powerful. The scratches were high up, much higher than any animal I could think of would be able to reach. I stopped at one of the trees, running my fingers over the grooves. They were fresh, the bark splintered and raw. A sense of unease began to creep in. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. At first, I brushed it off, chalking it up to the eerie silence of the woods. But as I continued hiking, that feeling grew stronger. Every so often, I would hear a crack of branch snapping in the distance, or a rustle of leaves, but whenever I stopped to listen, there was nothing, just the stillness of the forest pressing in around me. It was late afternoon when I decided to head back to the cabin. The shadows were growing long, and the light was beginning to fade. The trail seemed less familiar on the way back, and I realized I had wandered farther than I'd thought. My pace quickened, the weight of the quiet pressing in harder with every step. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but there was never anything there. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the clearing. I breathed a sigh of relief as I stepped inside, locking the door behind me. I felt safer with walls around me, even though I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that had followed me back from the woods. That night, after dinner, I sat by the fire again, trying to relax. But my thoughts kept drifting back to those claw marks. What kind of animal could have made those? And why were they so high up on the trees? I told myself it was nothing to worry about. The woods were vast, and there were bound to be things I didn't understand out here. It was just nature. But as the night deepened, I heard something outside. It was faint at first, a soft rustling sound, like something moving through the underbrush. My heart skipped a beat, and I sat up, listening. The sound grew louder, more deliberate. It wasn't the wind, it was something moving. Slowly. Carefully. The footsteps were heavy, crushing the leaves beneath them. I stood and walked to the window, peering out into the darkness. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. I couldn't see anything at first, but then, just at the edge of the tree line, something moved. It was tall. Taller than any human should be. My heart pounded in my chest as I squinted, trying to make out the shape. It was gaunt, with long, thin limbs, and its skin, what little I could see of it in the pale light, was ashen and tight against its bones. It moved in a jerky, unnatural way, like it didn't belong to the forest but was somehow part of it at the same time. I stepped back from the window, my breath catching in my throat. I knew what I was seeing wasn't normal. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a person. It was something else. Something wrong. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen, and against every instinct screaming in my head, I opened the door just a crack. I shone the beam of light out into the clearing. The figure stood there, just beyond the reach of the light, watching me. At first, I wasn't even sure it had eyes. But as the beam from my flashlight swept across the clearing, I saw them, two dim, hollow orbs reflecting the light back at me. They didn't shine like an animal's eyes in the dark. Instead, they seemed to absorb the light, pulling it into their empty, soulless depths. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt an icy chill run down my spine. It was as though the thing could see me, but not just physically. It was like it was staring into me, through me, like it knew everything about me in an instant. A predatory gaze that wasn't just watching, it was waiting. The creature stood perfectly still, but the longer I stared, the more I noticed a subtle movement, a slight twitch in its limbs, as if it were barely restraining itself from lunging toward me. I had the distinct, terrifying feeling that it was deciding whether I was worth the effort of pursuit. My pulse raced. I backed into the cabin, slamming the door shut and locking it. What the hell was that? My mind raced as I backed away from the door, gripping the flashlight like a lifeline. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. I sat down by the fire, trying to calm myself. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or my mind playing tricks on me after the long day in the woods. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. I had seen something that didn't belong here. The hours passed slowly, each one more tense than the last. Every sound outside made me jump: the creak of a tree, the rustling of leaves. I didn't dare go to the window again. The cabin felt like it was shrinking around me, the walls pressing in, the air thick with unease. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I stayed by the fire all night, the poker in my hand, waiting for the dawn. When the first light of morning finally broke through the windows, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I rushed outside to check the car. My heart sank when I saw the tires. They had been slashed, deep gouges running through the rubber. My mind flashed back to the claw marks on the trees. I was trapped. There was no choice. I had to leave. With my backpack stuffed with essentials, I set off on foot, hoping to reach the nearest town before nightfall. By the time I finally reached the road, my legs were aching, and my nerves were frayed to the breaking point. I flagged down the first car I saw, grateful for the look of confusion on the driver's face as he stopped to let me in. I didn't explain what had happened. I couldn't.